The courtroom was silent, suffocated by the weight of accusation. The air was thick, a suffocating blend of old wood, stale coffee, and the unmistakable scent of tension. Malcolm Pierce sat at the defendant's table, his posture straight, his hands clasped together to stop them from trembling. His dark brown eyes were locked onto the man across the room. William Sloan, the billionaire real estate mogul who had once been his boss, his mentor, and now his greatest enemy. Sloan stood, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Malcolm. His tailored navy suit was immaculate, his tie sharp, his confidence unshaken. A man untouchable. You think you can outsmart me? Sloan's voice was like steel, calm but lethal. You're nothing but a liar and a thief. The words echoed through the courtroom. The jury shifted in their seats. The reporters in the back furiously scribbled notes. The prosecutor smirked. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He had already lost everything. His job, his reputation, his dignity. All he had left was the truth, and he clung to it with everything he had. How did it come to this? The morning air in Atlanta was unusually crisp, the kind of chill that promised clarity but left you feeling unsettled. Malcolm adjusted the collar of his coat as he approached the towering glass building of Sloan Properties. For 15 years, he had given his life to this company, working late nights, sacrificing weekends, missing Xavier's soccer games, all to climb the corporate ladder, to build a future for his son. And now, as a senior financial analyst, he had finally made it. Or so he thought. The first red flag had been small. A discrepancy in the quarterly earnings report, just a few $1,000s unaccounted for. Nothing unusual. Companies made mistakes all the time. But Malcolm had been in this business long enough to know that money never just disappears. So he dug deeper. And what he found terrified him. Millions of dollars were missing, not lost, but funneled into untraceable offshore accounts. The deeper he looked, the more tangled the numbers became, buried under layers of shell companies and fraudulent invoices. It was a deliberate scheme. Someone was stealing from Sloan Properties. And when Malcolm finally traced the money back to its source, his blood turned cold. It was William Sloan himself. You must be mistaken. William Sloan's voice was smooth, his smile tight, but there was something dangerous in his gaze. Malcolm had stepped into Sloan's office that evening, closing the door behind him. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head 100 times, but now, standing in front of the man who had built this empire, the words felt heavier than before. I'm not mistaken, Malcolm said, placing a stack of documents on Sloan's mahogany desk. These accounts, Allegro Investments, Norwin Holdings, they're all linked to you. Sloan's fingers drummed against the desk, his blue eyes scanning Malcolm like a predator sizing up its prey. And what exactly do you think you've discovered? He asked. Fraud, Malcolm said plainly. Tax evasion. Money laundering. For a brief second, something flickered across Sloan's face. Annoyance? Amusement? Malcolm couldn't tell. Then, Sloan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Let me give you some advice, Malcolm, he said, his voice lowering. Forget about this. Malcolm's jaw tightened. I can't do that. Sloan exhaled sharply, shaking his head like a disappointed father. You've been a loyal employee, Malcolm. You're smart, hardworking. I respect that. He stood up, slowly walking around the desk, closing the distance between them. So I'm going to give you a chance. Walk away from this. Don't ask any more questions. And in return, I'll forget this conversation ever happened. Malcolm stared at him, his heart pounding. And if I don't, he asked. Sloan smiled. Then you won't have a career left to protect. The threat was unmistakable. Malcolm left the office that night with a sinking feeling in his gut. He had two choices. Stay silent. Keep his job. Protect himself and his son. Expose the truth. And risk everything. He made his choice. 1 week later, he was in handcuffs. Malcolm gripped the edges of the defendant's table as the trial officially began. Case number 32 to 8490. The State of Georgia versus Malcolm Pierce. The prosecutor, a tall, sharp-suited man named Nathan Brooks, stepped forward. He had a voice like a knife, slicing through the silence as he addressed the jury. This is a case of greed. A man who had it all, a high-paying job, trust, access to his company's deepest financial secrets, and he exploited it. He paced in front of the jury, gesturing toward Malcolm without even looking at him. Malcolm Pierce stole over $2 million from Sloan Properties. He betrayed the company that put food on his table. And today, we are going to prove it. Malcolm's fists clenched under the table. This was all wrong. Nathan Brooks spoke as if he had been there, as if he knew Malcolm, as if he had watched him work late into the night, agonizing over spreadsheets, trying to make sense of the fraud someone else had committed. When it was Derek Lawson's turn to speak, his voice was calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about betrayal. It's about deception. He turned, his eyes locking onto William Sloan. And the true deception lies in the prosecution's evidence, a web of lies spun to protect the real culprit, William Sloan. A muscle twitched in Sloan's jaw. For the briefest second, his mask cracked. But then he smirked again, leaning back in his chair like a king watching a peasant beg for mercy. The day stretched on, filled with witness testimonies and lies. Lisa Grant, Sloan's personal assistant, testified against Malcolm. He was acting strange in the weeks before his arrest. I saw him staying late, taking documents. Jordan West, his former best friend, turned against him. Malcolm was always ambitious. Maybe he thought he could get away with it. Each word cut deeper than the last. By the time the court recessed for the day, Malcolm felt like a man drowning. But as he stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin, he noticed something strange. Two men in black suits, watching him. When he met their gaze, they didn't look away. And for the first time since his arrest, Malcolm Pierce had the feeling that this case was bigger than he ever imagined. Malcolm Pierce stood at the top of the courthouse steps, his hands tucked into the pockets of his suit, his breath curling in the cold Atlanta air. The day had been brutal. Every word, every accusation, every sideways glance had chipped away at what little resolve he had left. He was losing. The prosecution was too strong, the lies too well-crafted. And now, these two men. They were still there, dressed in black suits, standing near a row of parked cars across the street, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Watching him, Malcolm's gut told him they weren't reporters or Sloan's people. They were something else. His lawyer, Derek Lawson, came up beside him, his voice low. "You okay?" Malcolm exhaled slowly. "Just tired." Derek followed his gaze to the two men, frowning. "Friends of yours?" "I don't think so." The men exchanged a glance, then turned and disappeared into the crowd. A shiver ran down Malcolm's spine. Something was happening. Something bigger than this trial. The next morning, Malcolm sat in his car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He hadn't slept. Not really. His mind kept replaying yesterday's testimonies, the lies, the betrayal. He thought about Xavier, his 14-year-old son, his only family. "You're going to win, right, Dad?" Malcolm had promised him he would. But now, he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. A knock on his window startled him. He turned. One of the men from yesterday. Malcolm hesitated, then lowered the window slightly. "Mr. Pierce," the man said, flashing a badge. "Special Agent Marcus Reed. FBI." Malcolm's stomach dropped. "FBI?" Before he could react, Reed nodded toward the courthouse. "We need to talk." "Not here." Inside, Malcolm hesitated. His instincts told him this was dangerous, but then again, everything was dangerous now. Finally, he nodded. "Lead the way." The conference room was small, bare except for a long wooden table and a few chairs. The air felt heavier in here. Agent Reed sat across from Malcolm, his partner, Daniel Shaw, standing near the door. "I'll get straight to the point," Reed said, folding his hands. "We've been investigating William Sloan for over a year." Malcolm's breath caught. "Federal crimes, money laundering, tax fraud, wire fraud," Reed continued. "We believe he's been running financial schemes through Sloan Properties for years, hiding money in shell companies, bribing officials, covering his tracks." Malcolm's chest tightened. "And what does that have to do with me?" Reed exchanged a look with Shaw. Then he leaned forward. "We believe you're being framed." The words hit Malcolm like a punch. "Sloan needed a fall guy," Reed said. "Someone with access to the company's finances, someone with a clean record, so when the time came, the blame would land on you, not him." Malcolm shook his head. "If you've known this for a year, why am I the one sitting in court while he's walking free?" Reed sighed. "Because we needed proof. And we couldn't move too soon. If we had, Sloan would have covered his tracks." Malcolm felt a surge of frustration. "So you just let me take the fall?" "No," Reed said. "We waited for the right moment. And that moment is now." Malcolm sat back, his heart hammering. "We need your help, Mr. Pierce," Reed said. Testify. Help us bring him down. Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. And if I say no? Reed's expression darkened. Then Sloan wins. And you take the fall for everything. Malcolm swallowed hard. This was a nightmare. If I do this, my son, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Can you protect Xavier? Reed nodded. We'll make sure he's safe. You have my word. Malcolm looked down at his hands. He had no choice. I'll do it, he said. Reed gave a small nod. Then let's take this bastard down. The courthouse was more crowded than usual. The air buzzed with energy. Something was different. Malcolm took his seat beside Derek, who immediately noticed his tension. What happened? Derek asked quietly. Malcolm hesitated. I'll tell you later. Derek frowned but didn't press. The judge entered, her gavel silencing the murmurs. Proceed with the prosecution's case, she said. Nathan Brooks, the prosecutor, called his next witness, Lisa Grant, William Sloane's personal assistant. Lisa took the stand, her expression carefully neutral. Miss Grant, Brooks began, pacing in front of her. You worked closely with Mr. Pierce, correct? Yes, she said. And in the weeks leading up to his arrest, did you notice anything unusual? Lisa hesitated. Then, yes, he was always staying late, accessing restricted financial files. I thought it was suspicious, but I didn't say anything at the time. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Lisa was lying. Derek stood. Miss Grant, let's clarify something. Lisa shifted in her seat. Did Mr. Pierce ever tell you why he was looking at those files? Lisa hesitated again. No, she said. Derek nodded. Did you ever see him steal money? Lisa paused. Not directly, no. Then you have no actual proof that he committed a crime. Just assumptions. Lisa's mouth opened, then closed. Derek turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is speculation, not fact. The energy in the room shifted. Even Sloan, seated at his table, looked tense. After court, Malcolm stepped outside, inhaling the cool air. He needed a moment to process everything. The FBI, the testimony, the weight of the trial crushing down on him. Then he saw it. A black SUV, parked across the street. Engine running. His stomach turned to ice. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Stay quiet, or Xavier pays the price. Malcolm's blood went cold. His hands shook as he typed a response. Who is this? No reply. His heart pounded. He turned, scanning the street. Was someone watching him? Then another buzz. This time, a text from Marcus Reed. We've got eyes on you. Stay vigilant. Malcolm closed his eyes, breathing hard. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was war. The text message burned in Malcolm's mind long after the black SUV disappeared down the street. Stay quiet, or Xavier pays the price. The words twisted in his gut, a threat he couldn't ignore. But there was no time to dwell on fear. He had a choice, give in to intimidation or fight. And Malcolm Pierce was done being scared. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. The media had caught wind of the trial's high stakes, and now the press lined the front steps, cameras flashing as Malcolm walked in. Mr. Pierce, do you have any comment on the accusations? Do you still claim you're innocent? Did you steal the money? Malcolm kept his head down, ignoring them. But inside, his blood boiled. They had already decided he was guilty. They didn't care about the truth. Derek met him just inside the courtroom doors, his face unreadable. You look like hell, he said. Malcolm gave a dry chuckle. You should see how I feel. Derek sighed. You ready for today? Malcolm nodded. He had to be. Because today, they were finally going to fight back. The judge called the court to order, and the prosecution continued their case. Nathan Brooks stepped forward, his voice smooth as he addressed the jury. Yesterday, you heard testimony from Lisa Grant, who described the defendant's suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to his arrest. He turned to the jury, his eyes sharp. But Miss Grant was not the only employee who noticed something troubling about Mr. Pierce. He gestured toward the witness stand. The prosecution calls Jordan West. Malcolm's stomach dropped. Jordan West, his former best friend, the man who had betrayed him. Jordan walked to the stand, his expression neutral, but Malcolm knew him too well. The tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the rail, he was nervous. Mr. West, how long have you known the defendant? Brooks asked. 15 years, Jordan said. Would you say you were close? Jordan hesitated. We were. Once. And in your professional opinion, did Mr. Pierce have the opportunity to embezzle money? Jordan glanced at Malcolm. Yes. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm's chest tightened. And did you ever see anything that made you suspect he was committing fraud? Jordan shifted in his seat. I saw him staying late, looking at private financial files. Brooks smiled. So you would say his behavior was unusual? Jordan hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Malcolm clenched his fists under the table. Jordan was lying. And worse. He knew it. When it was Derek's turn to cross-examine, he stood with a calm but sharp presence. Mr. West, he began, pacing in front of the jury. You've known Malcolm Pierce for 15 years. In all that time, have you ever known him to be dishonest? Jordan shifted. No. Did he ever steal? Cheat? Lie to clients? Jordan shook his head. Not that I know of. Derek stopped, turning to face him directly. So the only suspicious behavior you witnessed was that he worked late? Jordan swallowed. Yes. Derek nodded. Tell me, Mr. West, when was the last time you spoke to William Sloan? Jordan blinked. Excuse me. You heard me, Derek said. When was the last time you spoke to William Sloan? Jordan hesitated. Too long. I see him around the office. That's not what I asked, Derek cut in. His voice was sharper now. Did you meet with him privately? Jordan's jaw tightened. Yes. And what did you talk about? Jordan shifted again, his eyes darting towards Sloan, who sat at the prosecution's table, his face a blank mask. Just work stuff. Derek's eyes narrowed. Did he ask you to testify against Malcolm? Jordan exhaled, shaking his head. No. Did he offer you anything? Jordan looked uncomfortable now. No. Derek stepped closer. Then why are you lying? A ripple of gasps went through the courtroom. The judge's gavel slammed. Order. Jordan's face flushed. I'm not lying. Then say it clearly, Derek pressed. Do you believe Malcolm Pierce stole from Sloan Properties? Jordan's throat bobbed. He looked at Malcolm, and for the briefest moment, Malcolm saw the regret in his eyes. Then Jordan looked away. I don't know, he muttered. Derek stepped back, satisfied. No further questions. As Jordan stepped down from the stand, Malcolm saw Sloan's jaw tighten. He was losing control. The testimony wasn't the nail in the coffin, but it was a crack in the wall Sloan had built around himself. For the first time, he looked rattled. Derek leaned over. We're getting to him. Malcolm exhaled, his heart still racing. But the battle wasn't over. Not even close. The defense calls Calvin Monroe to the stand. A man in his early 50s stepped forward. He was a former auditor for Sloan Properties, fired under mysterious circumstances. He adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. Derek stepped forward. Mr. Monroe, can you tell the court why you left Sloan Properties? Calvin hesitated, then spoke. I didn't leave. I was fired. Why? Calvin's gaze flickered toward Sloan. Because I asked too many questions about missing money. The courtroom exploded in whispers. Sloan's legal team immediately objected, but the judge allowed it. Mr. Monroe, did you ever discuss these concerns with William Sloan? Calvin nodded. And what did he say? Calvin exhaled slowly. He told me to mind my own business. Then, a week later, I was let go. Sloan's fingers tightened on the table. He was losing control. And Malcolm? For the first time, he felt hope. As the trial recessed for the day, Malcolm stepped outside, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Then he saw it. The black SUV. It was parked at the far end of the lot, engine running. Malcolm's pulse quickened. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Reed. We're tracking the SUV. Stay calm. Malcolm exhaled slowly. The fight wasn't just in the courtroom. It was everywhere. And it was only just beginning. The black SUV was still there. Engine running. Tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Malcolm's breath came slow and steady, but inside, his heart pounded. He knew what this meant. Sloan was watching him. And worse, Sloan was warning him. Derek stood beside him, hands in his pockets. That's the same car from yesterday, isn't it? He muttered. Malcolm nodded, his jaw tight. You think it's Sloan's people? Who else? Derek exhaled through his nose. They're getting nervous. Malcolm clenched his fists. Good. But Derek shook his head. No, it's not good. It means they're desperate. That sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. Desperate men made reckless decisions. His phone buzzed. A text from FBI agent Marcus Reed. We see the SUV. Stay where you are. Malcolm didn't move. Didn't look away. Then, without warning, the SUV pulled off, tires screeching as it sped away into the city. Derek exhaled. They'll be back. I know. That night, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen. Old spreadsheets, financial reports, fragments of the truth he had uncovered months ago. It was all there. The proof of Sloane's crimes. But proof meant nothing if no one believed him. Across the room, his son, Xavier, sat on the couch, earbuds in, eyes glued to his phone. 14 years old. A teenager now. But still, his world was simple. Video games, basketball, sneakers. He didn't need to know about the storm closing in around them. Malcolm rubbed his temples. What the hell have I gotten us into? Then, a knock at the door. Malcolm froze. His eyes flicked to the clock. 10:42 p.m. Too late for visitors. Xavier didn't look up. Dad. Malcolm held up a hand. Stay there. Another knock. He moved slowly, silently, stepping to the door and looking through the peephole. No one was there. Frowning, he unlocked the door and opened it just an inch. Something fell to the floor. A package. Unmarked. Plain brown cardboard. Malcolm's stomach twisted. He glanced up and down the hallway. Empty. His fingers trembled as he reached down, picked up the box, and closed the door behind him. Xavier pulled out his earbuds. Who was it? No one. Malcolm's voice was tight. Just a delivery. Xavier shrugged, going back to his phone. But Malcolm's hands shook as he brought the box to the table. He sat down, stared at it. Then, slowly, he opened it. Inside, a single manila envelope. And on top of it, a note, typed in cold, precise letters. Stay quiet, or your son pays the price. Malcolm's breath hitched. He dropped the note, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, swallowing hard, he pulled out the contents of the envelope. Documents. His own emails, financial reports, notes from Sloane Properties. But someone had marked them up, circling dates, highlighting transactions, scribbling notes in red ink. Every annotation painted a picture, not of Sloane's guilt, but of Malcolm's. They were altering the evidence, setting him up even further, making sure that when the trial ended, there would be no doubt in the jury's mind that he was guilty. Malcolm stared, his body numb. Then his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello. Silence. Then a low voice. You think the FBI can protect you? Malcolm's grip tightened. Who is this? A soft chuckle. Back down now, or we make sure your son never sees you walk free again. Click. The line went dead. Malcolm set the phone down, his fingers shaking. His vision blurred as rage and fear tangled in his chest. Then, Xavier's voice cut through the haze. Dad. Malcolm looked up sharply. His son stood there, eyes flicking between the box and his father's face. What's wrong? For a moment, Malcolm couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Then, forcing a tight smile, he slid the documents back into the envelope and closed the box. Nothing, kid. Xavier frowned. You sure? Malcolm nodded. Too quickly. Yeah, it's nothing. Lying to his son made him feel sick. But the truth? The truth would get them both killed. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the courthouse with a new fire in his chest. The threats weren't working. He wasn't going to back down. Derek saw him and raised an eyebrow. You look different today. I'm pissed off. Good. Then, before the trial began, Malcolm stepped outside and dialed Marcus Reed. The FBI agent answered on the first ring. Something happened, Malcolm said. Talk to me. Malcolm explained everything. The package, the phone call, the altered documents. Reed's voice darkened. They're getting sloppy, he said. That's a good thing. How the hell is that a good thing? Malcolm snapped. Because it means they're scared. Malcolm exhaled sharply. What do I do? You keep fighting. You go in there today, and you make sure that jury starts seeing Sloane for what he really is. Malcolm closed his eyes. And my son. We've already got agents watching him. We'll keep him safe, Malcolm. That's a promise. Malcolm nodded to himself. Then he hung up and stepped into the courtroom, ready for war. The weight of the courtroom pressed down on Malcolm as he stepped inside. His shoulders squared, his jaw clenched. The threats, the intimidation, the lies, none of it mattered now. Because Malcolm wasn't backing down. He had one goal today. Make the jury see William Sloane for what he really was. And for the first time since this nightmare started, he had help. Derek leaned in as Malcolm took his seat. Did you sleep? He asked, his voice low. Not much, Malcolm admitted. Derek studied him. You sure you're ready for today? Malcolm's eyes locked onto Sloane, who sat at his usual place. Calm, collected, the king of his castle. But Malcolm saw it now. The tightness in his jaw. the subtle tension in his shoulders. Sloan was starting to feel the pressure. Malcolm turned back to Derek. "I'm ready." The bailiff called for order. The trial resumed, and the defense was finally taking control. Derek stood, adjusting his suit. The defense would like to call Calvin Monroe to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. Calvin Monroe, former auditor for Sloan Properties. Fired for asking too many questions. The man walked up, took his seat, and took a deep breath. Derek approached. "Mr. Monroe, can you tell the court why you left Sloan Properties?" Calvin's fingers tightened around the witness stand. "I didn't leave," he said. "I was fired." Derek nodded. "And why were you fired?" Calvin exhaled. "Because I found irregularities in the company's financial reports." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "And did you report these irregularities?" "Yes." "And who did you report them to?" Calvin's eyes flickered toward Sloan. "William Sloan himself." The room erupted. The judge's gavel slammed. "Order." Derek didn't let up. "And what did Mr. Sloan say when you brought your concerns to him?" Calvin's jaw clenched. "He told me to mind my own business. And a week later, I was fired." Sloan's mask didn't crack, but Malcolm saw the way his hands curled into fists. He was losing control. Nathan Brooks, the prosecutor, stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor." Speculation. The judge turned to Derek. "Mr. Lawson, do you have evidence to support this claim?" Derek smiled. "Actually, Your Honor, we do." He walked over to his table and picked up a folder. "The defense would like to submit into evidence a series of emails exchanged between Calvin Monroe and William Sloan's executive team. Emails that confirm Monroe's firing came immediately after raising concerns about financial discrepancies." Brooks' face paled. Sloan's fingers drummed against the table. The judge reviewed the documents, then nodded. "Objection overruled. The jury will review the emails." Malcolm exhaled slowly. The tide was finally turning. Derek turned back to Calvin. "Mr. Monroe, during your time at Sloan Properties, did you ever come across the name Allegro Investments?" Calvin nodded. "Yes. It was listed as a vendor in the company's expenses. But when I looked deeper, I realized it wasn't a real company." "What do you mean?" "I mean it was a shell company. A front. A way to move money around without anyone noticing." More gasps. Derek held up another document. "The defense has obtained bank statements linking William Sloan to Allegro Investments. These records show large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts, all under the guise of business expenses." The jury leaned in. Even the judge looked intrigued. Derek turned back to Calvin. "In your professional opinion, Mr. Monroe, was Malcolm Pierce responsible for these transactions?" Calvin shook his head. "No. Malcolm had nothing to do with it. This was Sloan's doing." Silence. A beat. Then, Nathan Brooks shot to his feet. "Objection." The judge sighed. "On what grounds?" Brooks floundered. "Irrelevant." Overruled. Sloan's calm facade was cracking. And Malcolm? For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt something close to hope. During the lunch recess, Malcolm stepped into the hallway to breathe. He barely made it 2 steps before Derek grabbed his arm. "We need to talk." Malcolm frowned. "What?" Derek pulled him into a private conference room, closing the door behind them. Then, he turned to Malcolm, his face grim. "Sloan's lawyers just filed a motion." Malcolm's stomach dropped. "For what?" Derek hesitated. "To have today's testimony thrown out." Malcolm's hands clenched. "On what grounds?" Derek ran a hand through his hair. "They're claiming Monroe is a disgruntled former employee with an agenda. That his testimony is biased and unreliable." Malcolm's pulse pounded. "Can the judge grant that?" Derek exhaled. "Maybe, but I'll fight it." Malcolm turned, his mind racing. Sloan was cornered. And now, he was trying to change the rules. Before the court reconvened, Derek made his argument. "Your Honor, the defense strongly objects to this motion. The prosecution is not disputing the facts of Calvin Monroe's testimony, only his credibility. But his testimony is backed by hard evidence." The judge was silent for a long moment. Then, she nodded. "Motion denied." Malcolm's breath rushed out of him. Derek gave him a small nod. And across the courtroom, for the first time, William Sloan looked worried. As the afternoon session began, Derek stood with confidence. "Your Honor, the defense has one final witness to call." He turned to the back of the courtroom. "The defense calls Special Agent Marcus Reed to the stand." The room went still. Malcolm felt his stomach flip. Sloan's face drained of color. Reed walked to the stand, tall, and composed. He took his oath, then turned to the jury. Derek approached. Agent Reed, can you tell the court what the FBI has uncovered about William Sloan? Reed's eyes locked on Sloan. We have evidence linking Mr. Sloan to multiple federal crimes, including fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. He has been under investigation for over a year. Chaos erupted. Sloan's face twisted with rage. The judge slammed her gavel. Order, but it was too late. The jury had heard it, and William Sloan was officially doomed. As the court adjourned for the day, Sloan stormed out, his lawyers scrambling behind him. Derek turned to Malcolm. We got him. Malcolm nodded. But it wasn't over yet. Not until the verdict was read, and not until Sloan was in handcuffs. Malcolm stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Reed. Sloan is cornered. Expect him to lash out. Malcolm exhaled. Let him try. Because Malcolm wasn't afraid anymore. The courthouse was a storm of chaos. Whispers filled the room. Reporters frantically typed on their laptops. Spectators exchanged shocked glances. At the defense table, Malcolm Pierce sat still, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. At the prosecution's table, William Sloan looked frozen. The once untouchable billionaire, always composed, always in control, now sat pale and stiff, his knuckles white against the polished wood. The FBI's testimony had shattered his illusion of power, and for the first time in this trial, the jury wasn't looking at Malcolm. They were looking at him. The judge banged her gavel. Order in the court. Slowly, the murmurs died down. Derek turned back to Special Agent Marcus Reed, who remained on the witness stand, calm, professional, undeniable. Agent Reed, Derek said, his voice steady. To clarify, the FBI has been investigating William Sloan for over a year? Reed nodded. That is correct. And you have evidence linking him to financial crimes? Yes. Derek paced slightly. In your professional opinion, was Malcolm Pierce responsible for these crimes? Reed's answer came without hesitation. No. Malcolm Pierce was framed. A ripple of gasps ran through the courtroom. Sloan's face darkened. Nathan Brooks, the prosecutor, stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the case at hand. The judge turned to Derek. Mr. Lawson, is your line of questioning relevant to Mr. Pierce's defense? Derek smiled. It's not just relevant, Your Honor. It proves my client's innocence. The judge sighed. Then, she nodded. Objection overruled. Proceed. The jury was watching closely now. Sloan shifted in his seat. His mask was slipping. And Malcolm? For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. During the recess, Derek pulled Malcolm aside. Sloan's in trouble. But don't think for a second he's going down quietly. Malcolm exhaled, glancing across the courtroom. Sloan was standing with his legal team, whispering furiously. What do we do next? Malcolm asked. Derek's eyes gleamed. We push harder. When court reconvened, Derek rose to his feet. Your Honor, the defense has one final piece of evidence to submit. He held up a thick file of documents. These bank records confirm that William Sloan personally moved millions of dollars through Allegro Investments, a fake company designed to funnel stolen money into offshore accounts. Brooks leaped to his feet. Objection. We haven't had time to review these documents. Derek didn't flinch. Your Honor, these records were obtained through legal means. They directly contradict the prosecution's case. The jury deserves to see them. The judge skimmed the documents. Then, she nodded. Objection overruled. The jury may review the evidence. Brooks looked like he'd swallowed glass. And Sloan? He was losing control. Derek turned, facing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard weeks of testimony, seen stacks of evidence, and heard from an FBI agent confirming the truth. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The prosecution wants you to believe that Malcolm Pierce, a man with no history of theft, no history of fraud, masterminded an elaborate embezzlement scheme. But the real question is this. He turned, pointing at William Sloan. Why would Malcolm risk everything? If the man who controlled the entire company had far more to gain? The jury leaned in. The answer is simple, Derek continued. He wouldn't. He took a step forward. Malcolm Pierce didn't steal anything. He didn't fabricate financial reports. He didn't hide millions of dollars in offshore accounts. He turned back to the jury. But William Sloan did. A beat of silence. Then, Sloan snapped. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Sloan shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Sloan, sit down." But Sloan wasn't finished. He pointed at Malcolm, his face red with fury. "He's nothing. A nobody. He should have never been in my company in the first place." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge slammed her gavel again. "Order." But Sloan was unraveling. "You think you can ruin me?" he spat. "I built this empire. I made this company. You think a courtroom full of fools is going to change that?" The jury stared in shock. The reporters scribbled furiously. Malcolm simply watched. Because he knew exactly what had just happened. William Sloan had just sealed his own fate. It took less than a day for the jury to deliberate. Malcolm sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together, his heart hammering. The jury foreperson stood, holding a folded piece of paper. The judge nodded. "In the matter of the state of Georgia versus Malcolm Pierce." A pause. "We find the defendant not guilty." For a moment, Malcolm couldn't breathe. Then, relief crashed over him. Derek clapped a hand on his back. The crowd exploded. He turned, catching sight of Xavier in the gallery, his son grinning through tears. Malcolm felt his chest tighten. He had won. Before Malcolm could leave, Marcus Reed intercepted him outside the courtroom. "It's over," Malcolm said. Reed shook his head. "Not yet." He handed Malcolm an envelope. "What's this?" "Official confirmation. Sloan's assets have been frozen. He's under federal investigation. He won't be walking away from this." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Good." Reed gave him a rare smile. "You did good, Pierce." Malcolm nodded. "So did you." Weeks later, Malcolm sat in his apartment, finally at peace. Xavier sat next to him, watching TV, their world finally returning to normal. Then, a knock at the door. Malcolm opened it. Derek stood there, grinning, holding a bottle of champagne. "Thought we should celebrate properly." Malcolm chuckled, stepping aside. "Come in." As they toasted to justice, Malcolm let himself smile for the first time in months. Because they had won. And no threat, no lie, no shadow of Sloan's corruption could take that away from them. Malcolm Pierce had been framed. But he fought back. And in the end, the truth won. The trial was over. The lies, the threats, the fear, all of it was behind him now. But Malcolm Pierce knew one thing for certain. Just because the war was won didn't mean the battle scars disappeared. For the first time in months, Malcolm woke up without the crushing weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest. No more court dates. No more whispered accusations. No more wondering if he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars for something he didn't do. He opened his eyes to the soft morning light filtering through his bedroom window. For the first time in forever, the world felt lighter. A smell drifted through the air. Coffee. He swung his legs over the bed and walked into the kitchen, where Xavier stood at the counter, pouring cereal. The sight of his son, calm, carefree, made Malcolm's throat tighten. "You made coffee?" Malcolm asked. Xavier snorted. "Nah, man, I'm 14. I know my limits." Malcolm chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Good. Stay that way as long as you can." For months, Malcolm had carried guilt, not for any crime, but for putting Xavier through hell. But now, they had a chance to start over. His phone buzzed. That evening, Malcolm sat outside his apartment, a cold beer in hand, watching the sun dip below the Atlanta skyline. The world felt different now. Or maybe it was just him. His phone buzzed again, another message from Marcus Reed. "Keep your head up, Pierce. And if you ever need anything, you know how to reach me." Malcolm smirked. For a Fed, Reed wasn't so bad. He typed back. "Same to you, agent." Then, for the first time in months, he turned off his phone. No more threats. No more late-night anxiety. Just peace. Malcolm took a long sip of his drink, feeling the tension finally slip away. Tomorrow, he would figure out what came next. But tonight, he was just a man who had survived. And that was enough. A text from Marcus Reed. "FBI officially arrested Sloan this morning. He's facing federal charges. No bail." Malcolm exhaled sharply. Sloan was finally done. For years, he had built an empire on corruption, believing he was untouchable. But in the end, his arrogance destroyed him. Malcolm texted back, "Thank you." Reed's reply came almost instantly. "You did most of the work. But I'd keep my guard up if I were you." Sloan had a lot of powerful friends. Some of them won't be happy. Malcolm's stomach twisted. Of course, even in defeat, Sloan's influence cast a long shadow. But Malcolm wasn't scared anymore. He had faced the fire, and he was still standing. Later that day, Malcolm sat across from Derek at a quiet cafe. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "So what's next for you?" Malcolm exhaled. "Honestly, no idea. For 15 years, his life had revolved around Sloan Properties. Now, that chapter was closed. You could start your own firm," Derek suggested. "A forensic accounting firm. You took down one of the biggest corporate frauds in Atlanta. People would pay to have someone like you on their side." Malcolm huffed a laugh. "I just got out of one financial mess. You want me to start digging into others? Hey, you're good at it." Malcolm leaned back, considering it. For the first time in his life, he had options. Freedom. "Maybe," he admitted. Derek smirked. "Take your time. You earned it." And for once, Malcolm actually believed that.